If you remember the last week, we started the invitations of Christ. He started to give you some different invitations, and like with any invitation, it often requires something. When I was asked to do the wedding, does it require me to do anything? You know, you have to prepare. What are you going to say? What about what clothes are you wearing? Do you go with the gift or do you go without one? Obviously, you go with one, so you have to do things. So invitations have a lot of things with them. So last week, if you remember, we had the first invitation that we had. When we looked at it was when John's disciples, remember John said, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world," and they then left and went to follow Jesus, and they asked Jesus, "Where are you staying?" And what did he say? "Come and see." And it was a challenge that made me think a lot about it too. How many times have you been asked, what is the Christian life like? How do you forgive? How do you witness? What do we tell people? Well, come and see. Watch. How do you, all those things. That's what we should be saying. Because I think most of the time we learn by example a lot better than we do just by looking at a book, whatever. So that was the first one, was to come and see. The second one you remember was in Matthew 11. You remember when Jesus said, "Come unto me, all you are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you what? Rest." So it was unloading the invitation, unload the load of sin. Obviously, you can't do it through works and keeping it, unloading. So it gave you the rest of salvation. And obviously, the same thing we said to all of us. How many of us have actually unloaded that to the Lord? The second verse in there is the next one. Notice he said, after you have had that rest, he said, "Take my yoke and learn from me." And then he says, "You'll what? Find rest for your soul." And how many is the one of discipleship? How many of us come to Christ by faith, but then we try to do everything on our own, and we're not yoked to Him? You have to learn to pull together, pull the direction that God wants you to by faith. So that was the second one, unloading the load of sin, and then the third one was that of the invitation of, like I said, of discipleship. The last one you remember we looked at last week was in Luke 14, was the invite to total commitment. And I think the invite to total commitment is where the challenge. If you remember in Luke 14, he said you need to, Christ needs to be above your father and mother and your family and everything else. One of the best examples of that, I think, what about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? You think of them in Scripture, total commitment. You have Daniel as a total commitment to Christ in the lion's den. You also, if you remember, he said you need to consider the costs. You need to consider the cost on total commitment. If you remember, he said, take up your cross how often? Daily. And follow me. So it's a daily thing. Every day we get up, we have something to choose. Are we going to follow him or not? And obviously we've seen great men and women. One of the best examples I can think of, you didn't know her, but Gene and I did, was a lady by the name of Miss Helen. Miss Helen never married. And the reason she's a phenomenal lady, but she was asked to marry a young man. And she said, "I want to be in full-time Christian work." He said, "I do not." So she said, "I loved him, but I wanted to serve Christ full-time," and he didn't. What would you and I do? Total commitment. And she was an amazing, amazing lady. Anybody that wanted something prayed about, you went to Miss Helen. And she worked with, similar to these, what we're talking about, working with wayward girls. And she had a young lady, talking with her one day, she had a young lady that came to her, came to know Christ. And she said, "Well, what do you want me to pray about?" She said, "Miss Helen, I want you to pray. My parents are divorced, my dad's in prison. I want to pray my dad gets out of prison. I want my dad and mom to be back together, and for them both to be believers when I get out of this, this deal of wet home for wayward girls, and be in the parking lot waiting for me." Now, what are you going to do if you're Miss Helen? She said, "Now here you have a young girl just come to know Christ. You can say, well, you realize it's God's will. You've been given a free will. You've been given all these things." She said, "She's not going to understand all that stuff. So what do? Pray. You start praying. What do you think happened? Her dad comes to know Christ in prison. He gets out of prison. He patches it up with his wife. and they're sitting in the parking lot waiting on her when they come up. You know? Now you know why people went to Miss Helen when they had a prayer request. She really believed, yes.
You need to tell them the rest of the story of Miss Helen.
Yeah, go ahead.
What she gave up to do full-time Christian service. Anybody here old enough to remember a very famous pianist named Van Cliburn?
Yes.
She was a student of Van Cliburn. Exceptionally gifted. Was destined to become a concert pianist and follow in his steps.
Wow.
And she gave it up to serve Christ and work with these girls. She was an extraordinary lady.
We had the privilege of having a lot of people that were at our college that gave up a lot of things like that, so it was really neat. But notice you had the others. You had the ones where it says that give up all your possessions. Doesn't mean you can't own possessions, but if Christ should own all you have, and if he says to give up something, just like Abraham was asked to give up something, we're saying, okay, Lord, you gave it to me, and if you want me to give it up, I'll give it up. And then obviously the last one, he wanted you to be flavored forever. Remember, he said the salt. I want you to be salt of the earth all the time, not just part of the time. So you think about that, the total commitment. Today I had 3 others I want you to look at. I think it's an interesting one. So to get the background of this next invite, go over to Luke chapter 9. Luke chapter 9. This is the reason for the request. Now this isn't the request, but it'll be the reason. Luke chapter 9 in verse 1 down through verse 7, you have the reason. In verse 1 it says, he called the 12 together, gave them power and authority over all the demons and to heal the disease. He sent them proclaiming the kingdom of God and to perform healing. Tell them to take no money with them. And they then left and went from city to city, and going from preaching, you'll see in verse 6, preaching the gospel and healing everyone. If you think about it, here are the 12, they get matched up 2 by 2, and they go out together, and they go to all the different places. Do you think anybody came to hear them? Do you think anybody had sick people they brought to them? Okay, so they've been going out, obviously, going to be a lot of time invested, and now they come back to Jesus. So look over in Mark 6, they've now come back. So let's look at what he's now going to tell them to do in Mark chapter 6. Here they sent them out. And obviously that would be quite something. Any of you ever been on a mission trip? How exhausted are you when you get back? You know, you're going non-stop, being asked things. Mark chapter 6. Notice in verse 30. This is just after it says, the apostles gathered together with Jesus. They reported to him all that they had done and taught. Give him a report what all they had done. And notice then his invitation. And he said to them, come away by yourselves to a lonely place and rest for a while. For there are many people coming and going that didn't even have time to eat. And they went away in a boat to a lonely place by themselves. They had an invitation. So what was the invite? Invite to rest. How many times do you just go so busy, going so much of the time, do you need a rest? You need a rest. Every one of us needs a rest. If it's interesting, when you look over in the book of Luke, and remember in Luke, let's go over to Luke for a moment, Luke chapter 5. So he's inviting them that they need to rest. And I think it's important for all of us, we need to rest. It's part of what our country was set up, the way it originally was. But in Luke chapter 5, Jesus does the exact same thing he's telling them to do. Jesus does the same thing earlier. In Luke chapter 5, notice in verse 15, but the news about him was spreading even further, and greater multitudes were gathering to hear him and to be healed of their sickness. But what did Jesus do? He would often slip away to the wilderness to what?
Pray.
Get alone. Be with the Lord. So often the busier that you get, the harder it is to get alone, but it's the time you need the most. Never forget hearing about Spurgeon, I believe it was, and he was given a lot more responsibilities. And how is he going to do it? More and more things were coming his way, and he says, that means I need to spend another hour in prayer a day. Like, what? You're given more jobs to do, and you're going to say, well, I'm going to know another hour in prayer, because I'm just going to have to get up another hour early. I mean, that's amazing. Spending time alone. So I think it's important to recognize Jesus is saying you need time to rest. There's a time to work, but there's a time to rest. That's how our country was originally set up. Why did we have Saturday and Sunday off each week? Why was Saturday? Because the Jews were off. Country with Jews, they were off Saturday. Christians were off Sunday. Obviously today everybody wants money, so we're open how many days of the week? Everything's 7 days a week. And so what happens, we often get away from this time of rest. But how many of you need more? Does everybody need the same amount of rest? No. And how many of you have noticed the older you get, the more rest you need? Instead of working 6 days a week, you now maybe can only work hard one day, whatever it might be. But we all need rest. And so we have to realize we need the rest, but also we cannot expect others to always follow the same pattern that we do. I think it's interesting. If you remember in the, just as a reminder, remember Elijah, the great victory he had when he stood up to the Jezebel and the 400 prophets and everything else and showed it to be true. In chapter 19, what happens in 1 Kings? Jezebel says, I'm going to do to you before sunset what you did to these 400 prophets. And what did Elijah do? He ran. But it's interesting, he was exhausted and God fed him. He slept. He wakes up. God feeds him again. And then God says, what are you doing here? And he has another job for him. He didn't scold him or anything else. He allowed him the rest and nourishment, and then he told him, what do you do next? I think it's important to recognize we need rest. There's a time, and we need to encourage others to have rest. How many of you can find that somebody else needs rest before they recognize they need rest? Ever see that? Maybe they're just a little short fused. Or is that only a few people that have to? Maybe in your own life does it take you longer to do a task because you're overly tired? You're forgetting things, takes you much longer to do something. And so what happens is then you get behind, and if you're task oriented, you think, what, I got to do more, I got to stay up longer, whereas you need the rest to get it done. So think about it. We need to realize we need rest. Plan your time, you need the rest. And encourage others to get away and do it. And whether it be your Sunday school teacher or whoever it might be. So I think if you remember we had a series even about the barrenness of a busy life. You can be so busy, be a total barren life. So the first one that we have today is the invite to rest, and we need that rest. So there's different kinds of rest. You have physical rest here. You have the rest of walk of faith. You have the rest of salvation. Many different rests in Scripture. So the second one I like to look at. Look over in Matthew 14. It's following in the same pattern here that you have in time frame wise. But look over in Matthew 14. In Matthew 14, if you remember, they had just got through with the disciples, if you recall the storyline. If you remember, Jesus says you need to get away, but the multitude follow them, and then Jesus feeds the 5,000, and now he sends them away. So notice in verse 22, he sends them away. They just fed the people. And immediately he made the disciples get in a boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he sent the multitude away. Remember, who needs rest? Okay, and the disciples need rest, and Jesus trying to take care of them, sends them away. And notice then after he sent them away in verse 23, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When it was evening, he was there alone. The boat was already many standing away from land, battered by the waves, and the wind was contrary. Now, according to the other, this is in two other of the Gospels, it was 3 to 4 miles. It says Jesus looked out and could see them. And according to the other Gospel, was Jesus' intent to stop and get in the boat? The other Gospel said his intent was to go right on by, because he told them to go to the other side and I'll meet you on the other side. Okay? So you are to get in the boat and you're to go on the other side. And with Galilee, it's surrounded by mountains, so storms can come up very quickly. So when you stop and think about it, these are seasoned fishermen. You're told to go to the other side. And Jesus said, I'll get with you there. Okay? Did he give you his word? Did he say what was going to happen? But what's the problem right now? You notice also, what time is it in verse 25? It's the fourth watch of the night. He came to them walking on the water. What's the fourth watch? 3 to 6 in the morning. So how dark is it? That's pretty dark in the middle of a storm. So if you saw something walking on the water, you could see why they wouldn't recognize it as Jesus. I mean, if you saw something walking on the water in the middle of a storm, you might be just a tad bit, not that you are, you're a seasoned fisherman, but you don't look out and see something walking on the water, very often. You think about that. He's coming, he's walking on the water. His intent was to go right on past them, but they saw him. And then notice what happens then when you look at it, the recognition. You go on, and it was 26 and 27. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were frightened, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. Well, I imagine if you were there and I were there, we would do the same thing. And when the disciples saw him, it was a ghost. 27. But immediately Jesus spoke to him and said, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Now in the other epistle, or other gospel, that said, that's the Greek word saying, "I am." So Jesus is claiming what? I'm God. And they knew who he was. And they knew exactly, I'm God, I'm over all, the creator of the world. It is I, I'm coming, I'm walking. Okay? Now what comfort does that bring you in the middle of this storm? He's the creator of it. Now I want you to think about this then. Notice then Peter. You look at what you have. Notice his request. Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." In the middle of a storm, at 3, 4, 5 in the morning, you're saying, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come out to you." Now how many of you, in the middle of a storm, want to get out of the boat? And I was in the middle of a storm on the Gulf of Mexico, and I was as sick as a dog, but I wasn't getting in the water. You think about it, it's amazing. So notice then the invite that Jesus gives to walk by faith. You notice the other Gospels have the story too. It was not only for Peter, but is this also being seen by the other disciples? So think about this, and what does Jesus say? Come. All right? Come and walk by faith, Peter. Does he ask any of us to come and walk by faith? Notice then, does Peter do a good job? Peter got out of the boat, he's walking on the water, he's coming toward Jesus. He's doing a pretty good job, isn't he? When did he start to sink? Notice then in verse 30. What was his ruin? But seeing the water, the wind, he became afraid, and beginning to sink, he said, "Lord, save me." And immediately the Lord stretched out his hand and took him by and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" He was walking on the water until his eyes got on what?
Circumstances.
But how many times is that not exactly the same true for you and I? We do just great when our eyes are on Jesus. That's why in Hebrews 11 it says, fixing your eyes on what? Jesus, the author and finisher of your faith. That's in verse 3. In verse 6 of Hebrews 11 it says, without faith it is impossible to what? So there is not one of us that we are not going to be asked to walk by faith in different things. But you'll notice it's going to be a reoccurring event in your life. He was asked to do it here, but he's going to be asked to do it many other times. You stop and you think about it. And by the way, it's interesting that the reason for this is it says because in Mark chapter 6, another one of the accounts said because they did not recognize Jesus in the feeding of the 5,000. So since you didn't learn your lesson, what happens? Here comes another test. And if you don't learn it, what's going to happen? Here comes another one. And it's that we are our entire life. He's taken us from one test of walk of faith to another test to another. Let's look at another one of these walk of faith that he asked of John. Look over in John 21. You notice in verse 3 down to verse 7, you remember Peter says, hey, I want to go fishing. This is after the resurrection. He's already appeared to him. And they said, we're going to go with you in verse 3. They went out in the boat, and they went all night, and they caught how much? Nothing. And the day was now breaking. Jesus stood on the beach, yet the disciples didn't know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to them, children, you do not have any fish, do you? And they answered and said, no. He said, cast the net on the right side, and you'll have a catch. He fished all night. And by the way, if you'll notice, a couple of verses later, they're in shallow water. Because Peter jumps off and comes to shore. And here you have seasoned fishermen who've been fishing the Sea of Galilee their whole life. A guy on the shore says, hey, hadn't caught anything? Don't you think they've thrown the net on both sides of the boat all day and all night? Hadn't caught anything? Hey, just try it one more time. Throw it on the other side. Throw it on the right side. And they do, and what happens? They have a great number, and according to the text, it says the nets did not break, and they had 153 large fish. What's the chances of the nets not breaking, of catching 153 fish, large fish, when you didn't catch a single one all night?
In shallow water.
In shallow water. But notice then, it's the walk of faith. And Jesus tells us to do something. It doesn't make sense. We're seasoned people. We know what to do. That's what we're told to do. You go a little bit later on in 21 and notice, what does he tell them in chapter 21? He talks to Peter again. And notice he tells them in verse 18, truly, truly, I say to you, when you were younger, you used to gird yourself and walk wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you'll stretch out your hands and someone else will gird you and bring you where you do not wish to go. Now this he said, signifying by what kind of death he would glorify God. And he spoke to this to him, and then he said, follow me. It's going to be a walk of faith, Peter, and you're going to have to experience a death that you don't want. And what would you say? I want to follow you, right? The next question, Peter says, what? What about John? If I got to experience this bad way of going, I'd like to know what's going to happen to this guy over here. And what does Jesus tell him? Don't worry about him. If I want him to live until I come back, that's none of your business. You follow me. Now, how many of you like to hear that? How many of you want to think that everybody ought to have the same? That Jesus is walking with both of them, but they both have different experiences. Have different things. Whether it's on the island of Patmos or whether he was crucified, they both had their own difficulties to follow. So think about it. Here you have this invite to walk by faith. What's Christ asking you and I to do? He's asking us something. What is he asking us to do? Where are your eyes? I can't do this. I can't do that. Remember Gideon? I can't do it because I'm the least of my family, and the family is really... What did David say? When Moses was asked to do it, he said what? I'm slow of speech. I can't do it. When God asks you to do something, he'll give you the ability at that time to do it. You may not have had it before. He'll give it the ability to do it then. So that's two of them. You have the invite to rest and refuel. You have the invite to walk by faith. And the third one I like to look at is in chapter 19 of Luke. And it's an interesting one. You know the story very, very well. The kids can all sing it. I'm sure you've sung it when you were a kid. Jesus is coming to Jericho. And who's the most famous resident of Jericho that we know about? Zacchaeus. And you'll notice he's the chief tax gatherer. So how well is he liked? In order to become a tax gatherer, you had to buy it. And then you could charge what you wanted because you had the Roman government behind you. So he had others underneath of him. So if you're supposed to collect $10 from every citizen to give to Rome, you could collect 15 and have Rome behind you. You give Rome how much? 10, and you get to keep what? 5. So he had others under him. So he was very, very wealthy and everything else. So here he is, but he's very short in stature, so when he's coming down, Jesus is coming, he can't see him. For what reason? Because the others are taller in front of him and he can't see, so he climbs a sycamore tree. So look at the invite. Then in Jesus is coming by, notice in verse 5, the invite. Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry, come down, for today I must stay at your house. Did Zacchaeus know that was coming? Okay, so if Jesus went to any one of us today and said, I want to come to your house today, what would you say? Oh, no, I don't have it cleaned up. How many of us would make similar things of saying no? By the way, where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am what?
Yes.
Jesus is there. But think about it. Notice then how excited Zacchaeus was. But then, of course, you have the religious leaders. Why is he going to be with a sinner? Which obviously we know he comes to saving faith because of the results that you have in the story. But the invite to fellowship, it's an interesting thing. Jesus, that's the whole reason he came to this earth, to invite us to have fellowship with him through the death of his cross in salvation, but he also is inviting us to have fellowship. According to the book of 1 John, verse 3 and 4 of 1 John, that's why it was written, was to have fellowship. But look over in Revelation, just talking about this invite to fellowship. Look over in Revelation chapter 3. It's interesting in verse 1, which we're not going to talk about Sardis, but just one part about Sardis in verse 1 of chapter 3 of Revelation. Jesus is speaking and he says, I know your deeds. You say you're alive, but you're really what? They're dead. They think they're really doing a lot for the Lord. The Lord looked at it and said, no, you aren't. But I want you to notice the Laodicean church. In 15, he says, I know your deeds. You're neither hot nor cold. Now, they were noted for 3 things in the city, a very wealthy city at that time. They're noted for their mineral springs. So people would come there to bathe, but you needed to be hot or it needed to be cold of any benefit. Lukewarm wasn't any good. They also were noted for their gold and their wool industry, their banking industry. So they're noted for these things, and they think they're really something, but they're not. And Jesus tells them then to do something in verse 18 to buy from him and really to see themselves as they really are. But notice in verse 20, how is it? Have you ever noticed that? He's writing to believers and he said, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I'll come in and dine with him and him with me. Jesus wants to have fellowship with the church at Laodicea, but they're out of fellowship and things are going on. Is Jesus knocking on our door wanting to have fellowship? He wants to have fellowship with Zacchaeus for salvation. But if there's sin in our life, according to 1 John chapter 1, he cannot have fellowship with us. And how many of us is he wanting to have fellowship with us, but we don't want to admit it or see it as it is? What we usually do when things are going wrong, we usually do what? I'm not as bad as Dan. I'm not as bad as Jerry. Whatever it might be. We have to compare ourselves to Jesus Christ and see it as he sees it. So you have the 3 invites then, the rest and refuel, the rest to walk by faith, and then the rest to invite a fellowship. So let's think about this, some questions. How many of you need a rest? Okay, are you planning it? And when you go then, don't plan 500 activities, because then you'll come back needing a rest after you come back from your rest. And how many times does that happen? Especially when you have little kids. You plan a vacation and what happens?
Tired.
You're more exhausted when you come back than when you go.
Back to work to rest.
Okay? But think about it and look at it. If you're short fused or whatever, someone in your family might need a rest, then what can I do to give them that rest? Then the walk of faith, I think it's interesting. What is Christ asking each of us to do? As a church, as an individual, what's he want me to do? And what are my eyes on? Why I can't do it? Okay, or how can I do it? And then obviously the last one is that of fellowship. I think it's interesting. Do I take the invite seriously? And do I invite others? Or do I have a lot of excuses? you can't come today, you can't do this, Lord, I'll tell you when you can come, or whatever it might be. But think about it, the fellowship that you have, the fellowship that you have, the fellowship that you have, the fellowship that you have.